The restaurant was a place that sparkled with wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting tiny lights like stars, and the polished wooden floors shone as if they had never known a single scratch. Every table had white linen, neatly folded napkins, and shining silverware ranged just so. The smell of roasted meats, fresh bread, and sweet desserts floated through the air, mingling in a way that made the place feel both luxurious and alive. Waiters and waitresses moved swiftly between tables, carrying plates with precision, nodding politely to the customers as if they were part of a well-rehearsed dance. It was the kind of restaurant where people came not just to eat, but to be seen, to make a statement without saying a word. In the middle of all this splendor, Maria walked quietly, holding a tray of drinks. She wore the standard uniform, a black skirt, a crisp white blouse, and an apron tied neatly around her waist. Nothing about her looked unusual or attention-grabbing, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She preferred to blend in. Her job was to serve, not to be noticed. Yet inside her chest, her heart beat faster than it should have for a routine night at work. There was always a small tension whenever she entered this world of elegance because, no matter how much she loved her work, she knew that she did not belong in the eyes of the people she served. Maria had been working at this restaurant for almost 2 years. She came from a humble background, and life had taught her patience, resilience, and humility. She had grown up in a small apartment where walls were thin and the sounds of neighbors drifted in like soft whispers. Her parents worked long hours, and Maria learned early that she would need to take care of herself, and sometimes of others. Despite the struggles, or perhaps because of them, she carried herself with a quiet strength that few noticed at first glance. Her real love, her escape, was music. The piano was her closest friend, the only place where she felt completely herself. But in this restaurant, music stayed tucked inside her heart, hidden beneath her careful, polite demeanor. Tonight, however, Maria had to navigate a table that made her stomach tighten. They were regulars, a group of four people who always came together, dressed impeccably, as if every thread of their clothing was carefully selected to display status. They talked in a way that made it clear they considered themselves superior to everyone around them. When Maria approached with the tray of drinks, they were laughing loudly, a sound that seemed sharp and brittle, like crystal breaking. "Is that all you can carry?" one of them said, smirking as her tray shook slightly under the weight. His words were coded in amusement, but Maria knew the bite underneath. She smiled politely, holding the tray steady. "Yes, sir, I've got it under control," she said softly, careful not to let any irritation show in her voice. The laughter from the table grew louder. Another woman, dressed in a deep green gown that shimmered under the lights, leaned forward. "She looks so ordinary, doesn't she?" she whispered, loud enough for Maria to hear if she listened closely. Maria kept her head down, focusing on her steps. Her hands moved with the practiced grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She knew the rules of this world: politeness above all, invisibility if necessary, and never, ever letting anger show. But inside, she felt the familiar sting of being judged, of being seen as less. She had felt it many times before, but tonight, the laughter and the mocking words felt heavier, sharper, like stones landing in her chest. As she poured water into glasses, she heard the sharp click of their laughter again. This time it was directed at her shoes, simple black flats, worn but clean. "Oh, how quaint," one of them said, a smirk playing on her lips. "She's not exactly dressed for this place, is she?" Maria swallowed a lump in her throat, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She reminded herself that she was here to do a job, nothing more, nothing less. She had been trained for moments like this. Keep calm, keep polite. Do not react. After setting the drinks down, she stepped back and gave a small, respectful nod. The elite guests barely noticed her movement. Their attention was back on each other, whispering and chuckling. Maria moved away, quietly glancing at the clock. Only an hour left until closing. Only an hour more until she could escape the judgmental eyes and return to her small apartment, where the weight of the world would lift off her shoulders for just a few hours. As she carried another tray across the room, her mind wandered to the piano waiting for her at home. She imagined her fingers pressing the keys, producing sounds that were pure and free. Music that did not judge, music that did not demand she prove herself, music that simply existed in harmony with her heart. It was a comforting thought, one that steadied her nerves as she returned to the table. The group at the table was still in conversation, now moving to gossip about someone else. Though Maria could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, one of them leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the polished wood. Do you think she even knows anything about art or music? Or is she just ordinary? He said with a laugh, as if the words themselves were a weapon meant to wound. Maria's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to say something, anything, to prove them wrong, but she reminded herself that this was not the time or place. She could not let them see even a flicker of the anger that bubbled inside her. Instead, she offered a polite smile, a nod, and moved on to clear some empty plates nearby. The rest of the restaurant seemed to pulse around her. The quiet conversations, the clinking of glasses, the soft rustle of the waiters' uniforms, it all felt distant, like a world she moved through but did not belong to. And yet, there was a strange comfort in her movements. Years of experience had made her swift and careful, able to anticipate needs and act without hesitation. The rhythm of serving, clearing, pouring, and guiding was almost musical in itself, a dance she performed nightly, even if the audience did not notice. In a quieter corner of the restaurant, an older man watched Maria from behind his reading glasses. He was not part of the mocking group but a regular who often came alone. He noticed her grace under pressure, her calm smile despite the sharp words thrown her way. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the tiny hesitation in her step when confronted with derision. But most of all, he saw resilience, a quiet strength that was far more impressive than any display of wealth or status in the restaurant. Meanwhile, the mocking group continued to enjoy themselves, oblivious to the way their words carried weight. They ordered dessert with exaggerated sophistication, making sure Maria heard every item, every request, as if testing her patience deliberately. Make sure the chocolate is rich, not too ordinary, like everything else around here, one of them said with a smirk. Maria's hands did not shake. She poured coffee and served the dessert with the same careful attention she had always given. She spoke with courtesy, her tone even, never betraying the storm of emotions inside. She reminded herself of why she worked here, the paycheck, the experience, and the lessons in patience. Yet, for all the mockery, a small spark of determination flickered within her. She would not let their words define her. One day, she told herself silently, they would see the real Maria, the one whose hands could create beauty, whose music could speak louder than their laughter ever could. For now, she endured, moved gracefully through the world they controlled, and kept her dreams safe in the quiet corners of her mind. As the evening wore on, the laughter of the elite group began to grow louder, more pointed. Maria knew the final moments of service were near. She adjusted her apron, smoothed the wrinkles in her blouse, and prepared for the last rounds. In these final minutes, she carried every plate and every cup as if it were a message. She might be mocked, underestimated, or dismissed, but she would not crumble. By the time the restaurant was nearly empty, Maria's steps were light, almost free. She had survived the evening with her dignity intact, and though the sting of their words lingered, it could not erase the quiet strength she carried. She returned to the back room to set down her tray, her heart still beating fast from the tension, but her mind already drifting to the piano waiting for her at home. That night, as she left the restaurant under the cool glow of streetlights, Maria took a deep breath and allowed herself a small smile. The mocking, the laughter, the judgment, all of it was temporary. But her music, her talent, her determination, they were hers, unshakable and waiting, just like they always had been. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that soon, very soon, the world would hear her in a way that no mocking voice could ever silence. The restaurant had finally quieted. The clinking of glasses and faint murmurs of conversation had faded into silence. As the last few guests lingered over their dessert, Maria returned to the back room, her apron wrinkled from hours of service, and breathed in deeply. Her body was tired, heavy with the weight of the long evening, but her mind was restless, alive with the quiet pulse of anticipation. She knew tonight would not end without leaving a mark. A soft knock came at the door of the staff room, startling her slightly. It was the restaurant manager, a kind-eyed woman who had worked there for years and often noticed details others missed. "You did well tonight," she said quietly, giving Maria a brief nod. "That group at table 7, they can be cruel, but you handled it like a professional. They won't forget that." Maria smiled faintly, grateful but not surprised. "Thank you. It's just part of the job," she replied, her voice steady. The manager hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the dining area, where a small piano sat in the corner, unused most nights. "If you want," she said, almost as if sharing a secret, "you could play for a few minutes before closing. Some of the staff and a few remaining guests would love to hear you, just for yourself too." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had often dreamed of this moment, of letting her music fill a room that was not her home, but a place she had grown accustomed to endure rather than enjoy. Her fingers itched for the keys, and suddenly the exhaustion she felt from serving melted away, replaced by a spark of something brighter, something alive. I can, she said softly, almost in disbelief. She hadn't expected such an invitation, and yet, deep down, she knew this was a chance, not just to play, but to reveal a side of herself the world had yet to see. The manager smiled warmly. I'll step outside. Take your time. Play however you like. Maria nodded and stepped into the dining room, her steps cautious at first, as if walking into a space that was not fully hers. The piano gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead lights, its black surface reflecting the dimmed room like a mirror. She drew closer, fingers hovering over the keys, feeling their smooth coolness beneath her fingertips. For a moment, she simply stared, taking a deep breath, letting the sounds she had imagined in her head for years settle into the room. She began with a single note, soft, tentative, almost a whisper. It was a gentle sound, like the first drop of rain against a window. Then she added another, and another, building a delicate rhythm that seemed to float through the space. The notes were simple at first, cautious, like she was testing the waters. But with each chord, she felt herself opening, letting the music flow from her heart rather than her mind. The few remaining guests, who had been quietly finishing dessert, slowly lifted their heads. They had expected nothing, and what they heard instead was unexpected. The notes were clear, precise, but more than that, they carried emotion, a story that words could not contain. Maria's fingers moved with grace, each motion deliberate yet natural, as if the piano was an extension of her own being. At table 7, the same group that had mocked her hours earlier looked up from their conversations, frozen. Their laughter, the sharp jokes, even the whispers, they all vanished. What filled the room now was something they had never anticipated, beauty, raw and unguarded. Maria did not glance toward them. She did not need to. Her attention was completely absorbed in the music, the story she was telling through sound. Her mind wandered to her small apartment, to the quiet moments when she practiced for hours, sometimes late into the night, her neighbors long asleep and the city silent outside. Those solitary hours had prepared her for this moment, for the chance to express what words could not. As she continued, the melody deepened, gaining strength and complexity. Each note carried emotion, a mixture of longing, struggle, hope, and resilience. The simple tune she had begun with grew into something richer, more profound. The piano seemed to respond to her touch, the sound swelling and fading in harmony with her feelings. It was no longer just music. It was a story, one that spoke of a life lived quietly, of challenges faced with courage, of dreams held close despite the judgments of others. At the back of the room, a few staff members had paused in their work, drawn to the music. They leaned against the walls, their trays in hand, watching in awe as Maria transformed the space with her talent. Even the kitchen staff, busy with cleaning and closing tasks, stopped briefly to listen, captivated by the beauty unfolding in the dining area. The elite guests, still seated at table 7, were unable to hide their astonishment. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Some of them whispered to each other, unable to articulate what they were feeling. Is she really playing that? One of them murmured, voice low and uncertain. Another covered her mouth with her hand, as if afraid that speaking aloud might shatter the spell. Maria's eyes were closed now, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Her hands moved effortlessly, dancing across the keys with a confidence that belied the hours of doubt and struggle she had endured. Every note was intentional, every chord carefully placed to convey a message beyond words. For a moment, the world outside the restaurant seemed to fade. The noise of traffic, the city's lights, the clamor of distant voices, it all disappeared. There was only her, the piano, and the music. She felt herself becoming part of something larger, a river of sound that flowed beyond the room, beyond the judgments, beyond the harsh words that had marked her earlier. The melody shifted, softening again, turning introspective. It spoke of longing and quiet hope, of the resilience that carried her through difficult days. Maria's breathing matched the rhythm, slow and steady, as if she and the piano shared a single heartbeat. She remembered the times she had sat alone in her apartment, playing to an empty room, tears on her cheeks, heart full of dreams and fears. Those private moments, once hidden and personal, were now being shared, not with the world at large, but with these people who had underestimated her. And the effect was immediate. At table 7, One of the men had leaned back in his chair, his face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. He had mocked her hours earlier, convinced of his superiority, but now he found himself unable to look away. Another guest dabbed at her eyes, faintly shaking her head, as if trying to comprehend the emotions the music had stirred. The laughter, the whispers, the judgment, they all felt distant, irrelevant, powerless against the flood of feeling that Maria had released into the room. The staff members exchanged quiet glances, their own expressions softening. They had seen Maria work hard, seen her endure endless criticism without complaint, but they had never fully understood the depth of her talent until now. Every note was a revelation, a glimpse into the soul of someone they thought they knew, someone they had worked alongside for months, perhaps years. Without realizing the brilliance she carried within her, Maria continued to play, the music growing bolder, more confident. She added layers of harmony, subtle flourishes that revealed both technical skill and deep emotional understanding. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a voice, telling a story that transcended class, background, and the shallow judgments of those who had mocked her. The elite guests, now silent and attentive, could feel their own hearts shifting. The arrogance, the pride, the need to assert dominance, all of it was being replaced by awe, humility, and an unexpected vulnerability. For the first time that evening, they were no longer observers of Maria. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, something that touched them on a level that went beyond appearance, status, or social standing. As the final notes lingered in the air, soft and resonant, the room seemed to hold its breath. Maria lifted her hands slowly, letting the last sound fade naturally into silence. She opened her eyes, and for a brief moment, she simply looked around the room, taking in the expressions of those who had doubted her, those who had laughed at her, and those who had quietly admired her from afar. No one moved immediately. The spell she had cast with her music still hung in the air, delicate but powerful. Then, slowly, a few of the remaining guests began to clap, softly at first. Then with growing intensity, the staff members joined in, their applause genuine and heartfelt. Even the elite group, still seated at table 7, hesitated for a moment before clapping, some still with tears glistening in their eyes. Maria smiled quietly, a mixture of relief and quiet pride washing over her. She had shared a piece of herself, not for recognition or reward, but simply because it was who she was. And in doing so, she had shifted something in the room, changed the way people saw her, if only for a moment. She rose from the piano, hands still tingling from the music, and offered a small nod to the room. The manager, who had been watching from the doorway, gave her a warm, approving smile. "You have something special," she said softly. "Don't ever let anyone make you doubt it." Maria nodded again, her heart full. She had survived the evening, endured the judgment, and now, for the first time in months, she felt a sense of victory, not over anyone else, but over the fear and doubt that had lingered within her. Her music had spoken for her in a way words never could, and for that, she felt whole. The night would end soon, and the restaurant would close. But Maria knew that this moment, this performance, would remain with her. It was a quiet triumph, a reminder that the moment after Maria's first few notes had passed felt like the world had shifted slightly on its axis. The atmosphere in the restaurant was no longer that of casual dining or polite conversation. It had changed into something rare and fragile, something that demanded attention and respect. The remaining guests, the staff, and even the elite group who had mocked her hours earlier, were all quiet now, caught in a spell they could not name. Maria had returned to the piano after a brief pause, her fingers hovering over the keys. She felt the energy in the room, a kind of tension that was both heavy and expectant. It was as if everyone present was waiting for her to speak through the music, and she realized that this was her moment, her chance to tell a story that words had never conveyed. She inhaled deeply and let her hands fall naturally onto the keys. The melody that emerged was different this time. It began softly, almost tenderly, but with a depth that seemed to reach into every corner of the room. The notes were deliberate, each one carrying a weight that could not be ignored. Maria's fingers moved with fluidity, guiding the music through gentle rises and falls, subtle pauses, and delicate flourishes. She poured herself into every note, letting her life, her struggles, and her quiet triumph seep into the sounds. At table 7, the elite guests shifted in their seats, a mixture of disbelief and fascination on their faces. The man who had mocked her at the start of the evening leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, eyes fixed on Maria as if trying to understand how someone so ordinary in appearance could command such extraordinary skill. One of the women dabbed at her eyes discreetly, her previous arrogance replaced with awe. They had not expected this. They had assumed she was nothing more than a waitress, someone to be observed, judged, and dismissed. Yet here she was, weaving a story with her hands that left them silent and exposed. The music grew richer, more complex. Maria moved seamlessly from gentle passages to more powerful chords, each transition smooth, almost effortless. The sound was no longer simply pleasant. It was compelling, magnetic. It demanded attention, not through volume or flash, but through the authenticity and raw emotion it carried. It was impossible for anyone to look away. A few of the staff who had been standing along the walls felt tears prick their eyes. They had seen Maria work tirelessly, seen her carry trays with careful precision, witnessed her endure the quiet cruelty of customers without complaint. They had always known she was diligent, kind, and patient, but they had never imagined the depths of her talent. Now, as the music filled the space, they understood that there was a brilliance inside her that could not be contained by the confines of a restaurant or by anyone's judgment. Maria's mind wandered as she played. She thought of the years she had spent alone with the piano in her small apartment, the long nights when the city outside slept and she practiced until her fingers ached. She remembered the moments when her heart had been heavy with worry, when the world seemed determined to keep her small, quiet, and unseen. Yet all of those years had led to this moment. Every struggle, every doubt, every whispered insult had been preparation for the chance to reveal the truth of who she was, through the only medium that ever truly understood her, music. As the melody swelled, the elite guests could feel a transformation within themselves. Their initial skepticism and judgment had faded, replaced by a strange vulnerability. The arrogance that had guided their laughter hours earlier was gone, replaced by an almost childlike wonder. They were witnessing not just skill, but honesty, not just performance, but the revelation of a soul. Each chord seemed to speak directly to their hearts, bypassing intellect and pride, stirring emotions that they had not anticipated. Maria did not glance toward them. She did not need to. Her focus was absolute, her mind and body in perfect synchrony with the music. She allowed the story within her to flow freely, letting the piano convey every nuance of hope, fear, resilience, and quiet joy. The room, once cold and judgmental, was now warm with attention, and the transformation in the elite group was impossible to ignore. One of the women at table 7, who had moments ago been laughing at Maria's appearance and demeanor, pressed her hands together on the table, unable to hide the tears that had escaped her eyes. She leaned forward slightly, captivated, as if trying to absorb every note, every emotion, every ounce of the story that Maria had poured into her playing. She felt something unfamiliar, something humbling. The world she had known, the world of appearances, of status, of superiority, had been quieted by the simple, honest music of someone she had once dismissed. The man who had led the mocking at the start of the evening rested his chin in his hands, staring at the piano with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. His eyes were wide, and there was a softness in his expression that had not been there before. The bravado and certainty that had defined him were gone, replaced with an uncomfortable but undeniable humility. For the first time, he realized that talent, courage, and authenticity could not be measured by wealth, clothing, or social standing. They were deeper, intangible, and far more powerful. Maria continued, weaving in subtle shifts of tempo and gentle pauses that made the music breathe. She let her imagination guide her fingers, letting the melody tell the story of someone who had faced judgment, yet refused to bow to it. The rhythm rose and fell like the heartbeat of her life, sometimes tentative, sometimes forceful, always sincere. Each note was a reflection of her journey, a declaration of her worth that no words could capture. The staff watched in awe. Some of them exchanged quiet, astonished glances. They had known Maria as a colleague, as someone reliable and hardworking, but they had never seen her fully. They had never understood that her quiet demeanor masked a talent so extraordinary, that it could silence a room, shift moods, and touch hearts. It was humbling, and it was beautiful. The elite guests, still seated, were no longer able to speak. Their previous judgments felt petty, irrelevant, and shallow in the face of the truth unfolding before them. The woman who had mocked Maria's shoes, her clothing, her supposed ordinariness, now sat still, hands clasped tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. She felt something she could not name, a mix of admiration, regret, and awe. The man who had been dismissive earlier felt a lump in his throat. He thought of the words he had spoken, the assumptions he had made, and a sense of guilt washed over him. Yet even in that guilt, There was recognition. Recognition that true talent could not be hidden, that it demanded acknowledgement, that it could change the way people felt and saw the world in a matter of moments. Maria's music grew bolder, yet retained its elegance and grace. The melody took on a narrative quality, telling a story of a person who had been underestimated, dismissed, and doubted, yet who continued forward with determination, skill, and courage. Every note carried weight, every pause was intentional, and the dynamics of the music mirrored the emotions she had lived through. She played with a depth of feeling that made the room vibrate with resonance, a resonance that went beyond sound, touching hearts in ways that were invisible but undeniable. The few remaining diners in the restaurant, those who had not been part of the elite group, also felt the effect of the music. Conversations halted, forks paused midair, and people turned toward the piano, drawn by the undeniable presence of the music. Even those who had never met Maria felt her sincerity, her honesty, her strength. There was something universal in the performance, a language that spoke across class, background, and expectation. At table 7, one of the women leaned forward, her hand resting on the table as if to steady herself. She looked at Maria and realized that the young woman before her, who had seemed so ordinary in appearance and so easily dismissed, possessed a talent and depth that could not be ignored. She had underestimated Maria, and now the reality of her brilliance was impossible to deny. The recognition came not with words, but with tears, with an almost physical ache of awareness, a humbling confrontation with her own assumptions. The man who had been the harshest critic felt his chest tighten. He had come to the restaurant to be entertained, to feel superior, to enjoy the sense of control that wealth and status provided. Instead, he was humbled, moved, and confronted with the truth of human capability. He felt a mix of shame for his earlier behavior and awe for the skill and emotion Maria displayed. For the first time, he understood that appearances could be deceiving, and that true talent and courage existed in unexpected places. Maria's playing continued, seamless and fluid. She allowed the music to expand, to explore, to convey the complexity of her experience. It was not about impressing anyone, nor about proving a point. It was about truth, expression, and connection. Every chord was sincere, every flourish intentional, and every pause significant. The story she told through the piano was one of resilience, of quiet strength, of the power of human spirit to transcend judgment and expectation. The room seemed to breathe with her. The music filled every corner, every shadow, every space between the tables. Even the chandeliers seemed to glow differently, the light reflecting in a softer, more gentle way. There was a sense of transformation in the air, subtle but undeniable. The elite guests had been touched, their previous arrogance softened into humility and appreciation. They had been. The sound of applause had barely begun when Maria, still at the piano, allowed herself a brief moment to take in the reactions around her. The restaurant was no longer just a room filled with tables and chairs. It had become a space alive with feeling, a place where walls and windows seemed to fade, leaving only the music and the people touched by it. The few remaining diners sat quietly, almost reverently, while the staff watched with awe. Their earlier admiration now deepened into a kind of astonishment. At table 7, the elite group who had mocked her hours earlier was silent for a few long seconds, as if trying to process the enormity of what they had just witnessed. One by one, the laughter, the whispers, the shallow judgments that had filled the air earlier were replaced by something entirely different: humility, vulnerability, and an almost painful recognition of their own assumptions. Their faces, once masked by pride and certainty, now revealed something raw and human. Maria did not rush to speak or to draw attention to herself. She let the music continue to speak, allowing every note, every chord, every gentle flourish to tell the story that words could never capture. The melody softened, slowing slightly, turning inward as though inviting the listeners to look closer, to feel deeper. She allowed her emotions to guide her fingers, letting the piano convey every moment of struggle, every quiet triumph, every dream held close despite the judgment of the world. A tear rolled down the cheek of one of the women at table 7. She had tried to maintain composure, tried to pretend that the music was simply impressive, but she could not hide the effect it had on her. The woman dabbed at her eyes, unsure whether to apologize for the tears or simply let them flow. She had mocked Maria, had whispered cruel things about her clothing and her manner, and now she felt a pang of guilt. But beyond guilt was awe. She realized that she had underestimated someone who had lived quietly, endured hardships, and nurtured a talent that could move hearts in ways she could never have imagined. The man who had been the harshest critic leaned forward, elbows on the table, chin in his hands. His eyes were wide, fixed on Maria's hands as they moved over the keys with precision, grace, and emotional depth. He had mocked her earlier, made cruel jokes at her expense, and yet he now felt a strange sense of admiration mixed with shame. He had seen arrogance and pride reflected in his own face in the mirror of her music. Maria's playing had done something impossible. It had forced him to confront not only her talent, but the limitations of his own assumptions. Across the room, the staff watched in silence. Some of them were wiping tears from their eyes, others stood motionless, unable to speak as they tried to comprehend what they had just heard. They had always known Maria was skilled, polite, and hardworking, but they had never realized the depth of her talent, the sheer power of her expression. Her music was not merely sound, it was emotion made visible, a bridge between her heart and theirs, a truth that could not be denied. Maria continued to play, her fingers gliding across the keys with a rhythm that was both deliberate and spontaneous. The melody flowed like a river, rising and falling, carrying the listeners along its path. She allowed herself small pauses, breaths in the music that gave way to the notes and allowed the audience to absorb the emotion. She poured into every chord. Each pause was a statement, a moment of quiet reflection that contrasted with the strength and intensity of the surrounding. Melody. At table 7, a woman's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her napkin. She had never expected this, never imagined that a waitress could hold such power through music. Every note, every chord, every rise and fall of the melody seemed to speak directly to her, bypassing intellect and striking something deeper, something human and unavoidable. She felt a sense of regret for her earlier behavior, but alongside that regret was a profound respect, a recognition that she had underestimated someone extraordinary. The man beside her, who had previously led the mocking, could not look away. He felt his throat tighten and his chest ache as he listened. The pride that had guided his laughter hours earlier was gone, replaced by humility and wonder. Maria's music had pierced the armor he had worn so carefully, revealing vulnerability he had not expected to feel. He realized that he had been judging someone not on the merit of her character or her skill, but on appearances, clothing, and social status. And now he understood that true greatness could exist quietly, almost invisibly, until the moment it demanded recognition. Maria's music shifted subtly, turning more reflective, almost melancholic. She played with a tenderness that spoke of the quiet struggles she had faced, of moments of doubt, fear, and solitude. The notes seemed to tremble with honesty, resonating with anyone who had ever felt underestimated or dismissed. The melody wrapped around the listeners, drawing them into the story she had lived, making them feel the weight of her experiences and the resilience that had carried her through. The room grew still, every ear attuned, every eye fixed, every heart silently absorbing the depth of her performance. The elite guests, who had come expecting to feel superior and entertained, were now completely enveloped by the truth of her music. They were no longer observers, they were participants, their emotions entwined with the ebb and flow of the melody. Tears flowed freely from eyes that had never expected to be touched so deeply by someone they had once mocked. One of the women at the table leaned forward, resting her chin in her hands. She was overwhelmed, not just by the technical skill Maria displayed, but by the raw honesty in every note. She could feel the weight of Maria's experiences, the dedication, the perseverance, the quiet bravery it took to endure judgment and still rise. She realized that talent was more than skill, it was the courage to share oneself fully, without hesitation, without fear of criticism. The man beside her, his face pale and eyes wide, swallowed hard. He had come to assert his superiority, to enjoy the spectacle of someone beneath him, and now he felt a humility he had not anticipated. He recognized the injustice of his earlier mockery, the arrogance that had guided his behavior, and he felt a deep respect for the young woman who had defied expectation with grace, skill, and emotion. Maria's hands moved faster now, yet with elegance and control. The music became more dynamic, expressing not just struggle and reflection, but triumph, hope, and the quiet joy that comes from overcoming challenges. She allowed herself to be fully present in the moment, pouring every ounce of emotion into the performance. It was no longer just a song. It was a declaration, a story told without words, a life lived fully expressed through sound. The staff could not contain their admiration. Some whispered softly to one another, amazed by what they were witnessing. Others sat frozen, overwhelmed by the realization that someone they had worked alongside for months had a gift that could move a room, change emotions, and challenge perceptions in ways they had never imagined. Maria's music was a revelation, a reminder that the extraordinary could often be found in ordinary places, waiting to be discovered. At table 7, the elite group was now completely transformed. Their previous laughter, judgment, and superiority had vanished, replaced by tears, quiet awe, and a deep, unexpected respect. They had been confronted with something beyond their understanding, beyond their control, something beautiful, authentic, and undeniable. The music had pierced their defenses, stripped away their pretense, and left them exposed to the power of human expression. The melody softened again, turning gentle and intimate, drawing the listeners closer, inviting them to share in the quiet moments of reflection and hope. Maria allowed herself a small smile, feeling the connection she had forged through the music. She realized that the power of what she had shared was not in impressing the audience, but in touching them, in showing them the truth of her journey, in creating a moment of genuine emotion that transcended judgment, class, and expectation. The woman who had mocked her shoes and appearance earlier dabbed at her eyes, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at Maria with a newfound understanding, recognizing the courage it had taken to endure mockery and still rise, to face judgment and still share one's gift. She felt humbled, moved, and grateful, though she could not yet find the words to express it. The man beside her, still pale and breathless, nodded slowly, a sense of reverence in his expression. He had witnessed a transformation, both in Maria and within himself. He understood that true greatness was not measured by wealth, status, or appearances, but by talent, dedication, and the courage to reveal one's heart. Maria continued, the music flowing seamlessly, each note a message, each chord a testament to her resilience and spirit. She played with a confidence and authenticity that commanded attention without demanding it. The room, once filled with judgment and arrogance, was now filled with awe, humility, and genuine emotion. As the final notes lingered, soft and resonant, a profound silence fell over the room. It was a silence of respect, of recognition, and of shared humanity. Maria lifted her hand slowly from the keys, letting the last sound fade naturally. She opened her eyes, meeting the gaze of the elite group for the first time since she had begun. Their expressions were raw, unguarded, and filled with emotion that no one spoke immediately. The spell of her music held them, and when applause finally began, it was heartfelt, unanimous. The restaurant had grown quiet again, but this time, the silence was different. It was no longer the tense quiet of judgment or expectation. It was a quiet filled with awe, respect, and a shared sense of having witnessed something extraordinary. Maria sat at the piano for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, her breathing steady but filled with a quiet energy that came from giving everything she had to the music. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of those who had once mocked her. The expressions on the elite group were unrecognizable compared to earlier that evening. The laughter, the arrogance, the superiority, they had vanished completely, replaced by humility, amazement, and something closer to gratitude. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the emotion her music had stirred, and Maria realized that for the first time that night, they were seeing her, not the uniform, not the job, not the appearance, but her true self. One of the women from table 7 hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. She spoke softly, her voice almost trembling. I had no idea. She paused, swallowing hard, unsure how to continue. Her pride had been humbled, and she felt a strange mix of shame and respect. You are incredible. Maria gave a small, modest nod. She did not need to say anything. The music had already spoken, and any words she offered would only be a whisper compared to the voice she had found through the piano. She allowed a small smile to pass her lips, a quiet acknowledgement that she had shared a piece of herself that had changed the way these people saw her, perhaps even themselves. The man who had mocked her the most shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He cleared his throat, his pride still trying to assert itself, but he could not hide the awe in his eyes. I didn't realize, he said, voice low. I'm sorry for what I said earlier. His words were halting, sincere, and Maria recognized that they were spoken from a place of genuine realization. He had seen the truth of her talent and the strength it had taken to reach that moment, and his apology, though simple, carried weight. Maria nodded again. She accepted the words without fanfare, understanding that pride was difficult to shed, and that acknowledgement, however small, was still meaningful. She had not played for apologies or recognition. She had played because it was who she was, and the fact that others had seen and felt it was a gift. not a requirement. The staff began to relax, the tension of the evening lifting. Some exchanged quiet smiles, others clapped softly again, unable to contain their admiration. They had witnessed something remarkable, a young woman, often overlooked, who had turned the power of her talent into a moment that left everyone in the room changed. Maria's courage and skill had not only silenced mockery, but had transformed it into respect. One of the remaining guests, a quiet man who had been observing from the corner, stood slowly. He was not part of the elite group, but had been touched deeply by the music. "You have a gift," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "Do not ever let anyone make you doubt it." Maria's heart lifted slightly at the words. They were simple, direct, and true. The evening had begun with mockery, with doubt, with assumptions about her place in the world. But now, standing at the edge of the night, she could feel a quiet triumph settling into her chest. She had shared her gift, faced judgment, and emerged unbroken. With her talent acknowledged and her spirit recognized, the elite guests, still seated, looked at each other with a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect. The woman who had cried quietly reached for her purse and seemed to consider something. Finally, she spoke again, her tone more deliberate, less unsure. I would like to offer you a chance," she said, glancing at the others at the table, who nodded in agreement. "There's a music program I know of, an opportunity to perform in front of larger audiences, maybe even professionally. I think someone with your talent deserves it." Maria blinked, momentarily stunned. The words were unexpected, and yet they carried a promise she had dreamed of for years. She had never sought fame or recognition, but she had longed for a chance to share her music beyond the walls of her apartment or the corner of a restaurant. This was not just a validation of her skill. It was an acknowledgement of her courage, her perseverance, and the hours of dedication she had poured into her craft. She lowered her eyes modestly, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady but soft. That means a lot. I'm grateful." The woman smiled warmly, her own pride tempered by the humility she now felt. "You deserve it. Truly," she said. "Don't let anyone ever make you doubt it." Maria nodded, feeling the warmth of the room, the shift from judgment to understanding, from mockery to respect. It was a rare and beautiful thing, and she allowed herself to savor it quietly. She had endured, she had performed, and now the world, or at least a small part of it, recognized her worth. The man who had mocked her the most, still seated, cleared his throat once more. I misjudged you tonight," he admitted, his voice low but sincere. "I assumed things based on what I saw, and I was wrong. You are remarkable." Maria acknowledged him with a polite nod, understanding that his words, though belated, were genuine. She did not need to dwell on the mockery of earlier hours. It had served its purpose in shaping her resilience, in reinforcing her determination to remain true to herself. The recognition now, in this quiet, honest moment, was enough. The manager, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. "Maria," she said softly, "you've done something extraordinary tonight. Not just with your music, but with your courage. You've reminded everyone here, including those who doubted you, what it means to share your talent and your heart without fear." Maria felt a flush of warmth at the words. She had never thought of herself as brave. She had thought of herself as determined, persistent, willing to endure. But perhaps that quiet bravery had always been there, guiding her through the judgment, the ridicule, the long hours. And now it had revealed itself fully through her music. She allowed herself a small smile, feeling a sense of completion. The evening that had begun with mockery had ended with recognition, emotion, and a transformation that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was proof that talent, resilience, and honesty could overcome doubt, criticism, and assumptions. The staff began to tidy the room, clearing tables and resetting chairs, but they did so quietly, as if not wanting to disturb the lingering magic of the moment. Some glanced at Maria with newfound respect, understanding that they had witnessed something rare, a young woman who had turned judgment into admiration through sheer talent and courage. The elite guests lingered, still processing the experience. Some whispered to one another, reflecting on their own behavior, while others simply sat quietly, lost in thought. They had come expecting a dinner of elegance and entertainment, a chance to assert status, and instead they had been confronted with something far more powerful, a demonstration of human potential, authenticity, and grace. Maria stood from the piano, her movements calm and measured. She walked toward the door, her apron slightly creased, her hair gently framing her face. And yet there was a light in her eyes that could not be hidden. She had faced judgment, mockery, and doubt, and she had emerged not only unbroken, but celebrated for her true self. The woman from table 7 rose slowly. "Before you go," she said, her voice steady now, "please know that you have left an impression tonight that none of us will forget. Your music, your courage, it's extraordinary. Thank you for sharing it with us." Maria nodded, a quiet smile on her lips. "Thank you for listening," she replied. Her words were simple, but they carried sincerity, humility, and pride all in one breath. She had given everything she had to the piano, and now the room had responded not with judgment, but with recognition and respect. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights flickering softly around her, Maria felt a sense of calm and fulfillment. The streets were quiet, the sounds of distant traffic a gentle reminder of the world beyond the restaurant. She had survived another day of judgment, and she had shared something far more important than words could convey: her heart, her talent, her story. Her thoughts wandered to the opportunities that might come, the people she could meet, the audiences she could reach. But for now, she allowed herself to simply walk, to breathe, and to feel the quiet triumph of having been true to herself. She had faced mockery and doubt, and through music, she had turned them into admiration and respect. She thought of the piano at home, waiting for her next practice, her next song, her next chance to tell a story that only she could tell. She knew the journey ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges, critics, and those who still judged by appearances. But she also knew this: her talent, her resilience, and her courage were stronger than any doubt the world could cast her way. As Maria walked through the quiet streets, a soft smile lingered on her lips. Tonight had been more than a performance. It had been a declaration, a quiet triumph, a reminder that the world could sometimes be harsh, but honesty, talent, and courage could break through even the toughest barriers. She paused for a moment, looking up at the sky, the city lights reflecting faintly in her eyes. She whispered to herself, not out loud, but in the quiet place within her heart, "This is only the beginning." And with that thought, she continued walking,